On Sunday nights, we have been studying through or looking at a series of lessons from the Power Lectureship in South Haven, Georgia, on David's life. And tonight, or last week rather, before we get to tonight, last week we started the second phase of our examination. We went from David as a soldier to David as a sovereign, or David the sovereign heart chosen for leadership, a chosen heart. And so we continue that this evening as we look at David as a heart with a heart chosen to be sovereign or to be king. But as you see before us, it's not David's name that we have before us. It's Saul's name. And I think it would be hard to fully appreciate what David did as a king or how he became a king if we didn't look at Saul. And so tonight we're going to look at Saul's reign, the ascent and decline, unfortunately, that he underwent. But our base text is from 1 Samuel, the 15th chapter. And some of us from lads to leaders were around right before services. And so I asked these two ladies down here on my left, don't get nervous, I won't tell them what your response was. What if your husbands came home to you and said, I'm going with the girl next door, she's just better than you? Like I said, I'm going to keep their responses private. But imagine hearing those words from wife or from a husband, right? Imagine worse yet, hearing those words from God. And what God says is, we're going to see, if you would turn there to 1 Samuel the 15th chapter, verse 28. What God says to Saul is, today I have torn the kingdom from you, and I'm going to give it to your neighbor who is a better man than thee or you. Wow. That's tough. That's tough. We examine this tonight for two reasons. One, to avoid the mistakes that Saul made. To realize that we are all susceptible to them. To realize that that kind of failures can be mine. And also to contrast them to the heart of David as the kind of leaders, the kind of Christian people that God would have us to be. If you are there, 1 Samuel, the 15th chapter, and verse 28, and Samuel said to him being Saul, the Lord has torn the kingdom of Israel from you this day, and has given it to a neighbor of yours, who is better than you. Who is better than you. By the time these words are spoken, it's too late. The judgment has been decided. The cast or die have been cast. It's important to see these warning signs before they take place. Now, Saul had a great start. We're going to summarize a number of chapters here very quickly, but if you'd go back to the 9th chapter, you'll see that Saul's ascent to the kingdom starts in that 9th chapter. And it starts by chasing donkeys. Saul's father Kish has lost a group of donkeys, and for 3 days Saul and some of the servants go searching all the land, and they ride through much of Judah looking for these donkeys, but can't find them. And one of the servants say to Saul says to the servant, we better get home before our father, or my father, quits worrying about the donkeys and starts worrying about me. We've had those experiences, right, Sean? It's time to go home before Dad quits worrying about other things and starts worrying about me. And so as they're preparing to go back to Kish, one of the servants says, there's a man of God here. Let's go inquire of him. Unbeknownst to Saul, God has already approached Samuel and said to Samuel, tomorrow about this time there's going to come a man to you looking for donkeys. Now in Summerville, that would catch your attention. I imagine that this time it wasn't completely unordinary or out of the realm of possibilities or something that's common. But this is the man that we are going to use, that I am going to use to deliver the people. This is going to be their king. And so Saul approaches them, and you want to talk about selling something. Samuel sees Saul approaching, and he says, "Come to me, Saul, and in time, I'm going to tell you all about your donkeys and what you need to know about those donkeys." Number one, he knows his name. Number two, he knows why he's coming. Number three, he says, "Listen, we're going to have dinner, and then we're going to have a talk. I'm going to talk to you about some really big things concerning the kingdom." And Saul says something really important. We're going to look at a little closer in a few moments, but I want you to be aware of it now. Saul says, "What? Me, a Benjamite, the least of all the tribes, and my father, the least of all in Benjamin? Me?" What a statement of humility, especially compared or contrasted to where Saul ends up. And so Saul meets with Samuel, and after that dinner where it's been prepared for all the people of the town, and Samuel has the best portions set aside for Saul, he anoints him king. And then a week later, he comes back, and he told Saul this. He said, "I'm going to come, and I'm going to announce that you're king." And so when Saul's coming back home, his uncle meets him along the way and says, "What happened?" He said, "I talked to Samuel." "What did Samuel say?" Isn't it interesting? Saul tells him everything he says about the donkeys, but about kingship, he mentions nothing. Keeps it to himself. And so the following week, when Samuel shows up, the man who's supposed to be king isn't there, and they say, "Is there yet another man?" Do any of you guys remember where Saul was? I wish Ernie was here. Because the King James, a week ago, Wednesday night, Ernie brought up that they had taken stuff out of Ai. He said, "That doesn't sound like a very biblical word, stuff." And in the King James, Saul is hiding with the stuff. That's where Saul's at. In the ESV, he's hiding with the baggage. It's still stuff. He's hiding. And now, I could maybe get away with hiding in the baggage, but Saul was head and shoulders above everyone else, and so he didn't hide very well, and they find him, and this is our king. Think of the humility. Think of how much Saul is stepping away from power and away from the spotlight. Oh, if he had kept an ounce of that leadership. Saul does well at first. He unifies the kingdom. He wins great battles. But then presumptuous gets the best of him. He's getting ready to go to the battle against the Amorites, and Samuel's supposed to come and make an offering. And the priests were the ones to make the offering. Samuel gets impatient. A fellow preacher told me one time he got tired of his wife being late for services or pushing their limits, and so he left her at the house and went to services. I do that on a regular basis, or she leaves before me, so it's normal at our house. It's not normal in his household. I said, "Well, how'd things go?" He said, "It wasn't a good Lord's Day." You ever get impatient and do something you shouldn't have done? Saul does a big one. He gets presumptuous and he makes a sacrifice that he should have never made. And then following the battle, when God said that you are to kill all the people, including the king, don't take them captive, Saul spares Agag's life. Things are heading downhill. And shortly thereafter, that the Spirit of God leaves Saul and he is tormented. He becomes jealous of David. He pursues David's life. He throws a spear at him while he's playing the harp, but worse yet, as we're going to see in just a little bit in 1 Samuel 22, he slays the priest and all who were willing to help David. His fellow Israelites, his subordinates, wouldn't even do it. It took a foreigner to fulfill his command to slay the priest. The end of Saul's life was drastically different than the potential he showed. How does it take place? Before we look at the details, I would like us all to be mindful of the fact that anywhere we go, anywhere we get to, any destination we arrive at, we do so one step at a time. One step at a time. And the significance of that is that you can step out here on Route 28 and you can start walking and it feels like you're not getting anywhere. But you keep it up. In a period of time, you can cover quite a distance. That can be so for the good, and that can be so for the bad as well. Saul's destination was not where his potential had him. Number one, we're going to consider the fact that Saul went from humble to haughty. From humble to haughty. In 1 Samuel 9:21, I just referenced this verse a few moments ago, but he says, am I not of the tribe of Benjamin? And of the least of that household. He's saying the least of the least. He has this mindset that I'm not worthy. Why would you come to me? To even lead the people. But it's not long after that he's not only willing to lead the people, but he's willing to act for God. He becomes presumptuous in the 13th chapter as he makes a sacrifice for Samuel. It's in 1 Kings, the 15th chapter, in verses 3 through 9, that he spares Agag's life. Why is that significant? Not because he showed mercy. That was his excuse. He was violating a direct command from God. He started off humble, but he quickly became haughty. Christian read for us from Romans, the 12th chapter, and verse 3, where Paul says, I'm going to start in verse 1. It's almost impossible for me not to. For the grace that's given to me, I say to everyone among you, not to think of himself more highly than he ought to think, but to think with sober judgment, each according to the measure of faith that God has assigned. How many troubles come about in our lives, in our families, in our communities, and in our church? Because I am most important. Because what I want takes precedence over all else. Paul's urging, and the other side of this is that Saul had an important job to do. And when you look at the rest of this passage, it's not saying really that you're all lowly. It's saying we all have a purpose, we all have a task. Specifically, we have a gift within the context of the body of Christ. But it's important that we understand that we're part of the whole. Saul began to think, it would seem, it was all about him. He'd lost his humility. In Proverbs 16th chapter and verse 18, you might not ring off and be able to quote that verse, but I am imagining that most of you have heard this verse. It says something about pride and a haughty spirit. But in Proverbs, the 16th chapter, in verse 18, pride goes before destruction, and a haughty spirit before a fall. Pride goes before destruction, and a haughty spirit before a fall. It's interesting to me how many times the New Testament speaks of humility. We need humility in dealing with one another. We need humility in dealing with our community. And we need a lot of humility when it comes to dealing with the Almighty Creator of the universe. Saul went from humble to haughty. Secondly, Saul went from fearless to fearful. Fearless to fearful. Now you might say, well, how was he fearless? He was hiding in the stuff or in the baggage. But in 1 Samuel 11th chapter and verse 11, very early in his reign, we see he's fighting the Amalekites and they break up and they're spreading everywhere. And Saul says, we will break into 3 different units, 3 different parts, and each one go down, and they continued in the heat of the sun until there were not 2 Amalekites together. That's bravery, as you guys have been preparing. That's strong and that's courageous, right? Yes. And isn't it interesting? It's just 6 chapters later. It's interesting to me to notice how much of Saul's life flips upside down in just 6 chapters of the Bible. 6 chapters later, he won't raise his sword against one man. Now, albeit that's a giant. But how silly does he look when a little shepherd boy shows up and does the job for him? Paul went from fearless to fearful. I think in the church, we need to be mindful of this. 1 Timothy, or 2 Timothy rather, chapter 1, verse 7. For God gave us not the spirit of fear, but of power and love and self-control. The past 3 years, the world has changed rapidly. There's lots of cause or need or lots of reason to fear. We as Christians must understand that that's not the Spirit of God. That the Spirit He has given us is of love and of power and of self-control. People ask me periodically when I'm working, and it's said in the church, in my estimation, far too often, aren't you afraid of the world your children are growing up in? Aren't you afraid of the world that they're going to have to live in? My answer is no. I'm not fearful. I'm raising soldiers that through the power of Christ were born in this time, for this time, and for a purpose. God's in control. I'm not in control. That I'm thankful for. We are to deal in hope. We have the words of salvation. Are there things that are fearful in this life? Absolutely. Absolutely. But in the grand scheme, in the big picture, it's in God's hands. Paul once understood that. Saul. This is not the same Saul that was renamed Paul. Saul once understood that. This is exactly, I think, why Joshua had to be told so many times, be strong, be courageous. I am with you. I will give you the land. The task ahead of him, you talk about a time that was changing. Many of him, Joshua was probably born a slave. He watched all of his elders die. Anyone his age or older is dead. And now we're going to battle. There's reason to fear. And so over and over, God's saying, be strong, be courageous. The church that the Hebrew writer was writing to was seeing tremendous change. Far more significant than what Saul was seeing in his life. I believe more significant than what we're seeing in our time. And as he's concluding this letter to the Hebrew Christians, where he's admonishing them over and over again, do not turn back to what you have. Do not turn to the physical. Hold strong to Christ. Towards the end of chapter 12, he tells them, you have a kingdom that's unshakable. In verse 6 of chapter 13, he reminds them that we can say, the Lord is on my side. Who, therefore, can be against us? You see, there was a time when Saul knew that. But Saul began to live in fear. Fearless to fearful. Thirdly, Paul went from merry to miserable. From merry to miserable. In 1 Samuel, the 11th chapter, and verse 15, there we see that all the men of Israel, all the people of Israel, I'm there, so I'll go ahead and read it. So all the people went to Gilgal, and they made Saul king before the Lord in Gilgal. And they sacrificed peace offerings before the law, and there Saul and all the men of Israel rejoiced greatly. The beginning of his reign started out really good. He's joyful. But you may recall chapter 16, just a few chapters later, that David's introduced to Saul playing his harp. Do you remember why why David was playing the harp for him? It's because his soul was tormented. He had lost his rejoicing, his joy. He'd lost it. Chapter 16, verse 14, look what's said here. And the first statement is the most important in all of it. Now the Spirit of the Lord departed from Saul, and a harmful spirit from the Lord tormented him. And we see from this point forward, Saul is turbulent at best, unpredictable, and certainly unhappy. I've got to wonder if this isn't at least in part what David had in mind in the 51st Psalm, where he says, restore unto me, O Lord, the joy of my salvation, and then I will teach the sinner. Restore unto me the joy of my salvation. Saul had lost his joy. The 14th chapter of Proverbs and verse 30 says, a tranquil heart gives life to the flesh, but envy makes the bones rot. But envy makes the bones rot. There's a subtle difference between envy and jealousy. Jealousy is looking at what someone else has and saying, I want that. Envy is looking at what someone else has and saying, they don't deserve that. And so oftentimes the two go hand in hand. They don't deserve it, I want it. But there's subtle difference. I believe that one of the greatest plagues of our culture today is envy. That's why people rejoice at bad news. That's why when someone hears something good, they say something along the lines of, well, it must be nice. Someone's making the money. Right? And add a whole list of similar statements. It's rottenness to the bones. And it is glorified in our culture today. It's the norm. What took Saul's merry spirit? A lot of things, as we see the spirit departed from him. But one of them was envy. One of them was envy. It rotted him, his very bones. Let us remember these, and we'll look at this one more time yet in Galatians, the 5th chapter. I'm going to read about joy in a moment. You notice how much joy is down in this corner. There's a lot of giggling taking place down here. I'm going to trust that it's appropriate joy. Galatians 5, verse 22. But the fruit of the Spirit is love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness, faithfulness, gentleness, self-control. Against these things, there's no law. There's no law against these. We need to make sure that our lives, our Christian walk, are marked by the Spirit of God. When the Spirit of God left Saul, he lost all these things. We're to be people of love and joy and peace and patience and kindness and goodness and self-control. Speaking of self-control, Saul went from under control to out of control. He's pointing up there. Who is that? Who is that? Huh? He's pointing. He's saying something about it. You make those faces sometimes, don't you? Yeah. He went from under control to out of control. Now, I mentioned earlier in chapter 9, Saul is anointed king. In chapter 10, all the people, most of the people, honor him as king, and they all bring gifts. But I kind of alluded to this earlier. I didn't allude to it. I openly stated it. When anything good happens, there's always going to be a group of people that are upset to see it. Right? Whether it's jealousy or envy or some other reason, there's going to be a group of people that did. Understand this. In chapter 10, these people show up to Saul's crowning ceremony, if you will, when everyone else is giving gifts, and it's as though they want him to know he is there, just so they can take notice, Saul can take notice that they're not giving him a gift. You ever see someone leave a penny or a nickel for a tip? That's enough to say, I didn't forget, this is intentional, right? They show up to say, we're here, we don't respect you. Does anyone know what Saul did? You may be turned there, maybe not. Exactly what you just did. He held his peace. He held his peace. Compare that kind of self-control to the 22nd chapter that we talked about earlier, where he slays all of the kings, all of the priests for helping David. He's lost control. In 2 Peter, the 1st chapter and verse 5, there Saul, it would seem, had lost track of this. Saul did not do what Peter said to do, to add to your faith all these things that followed. You see, Saul, we're almost there. Either I'm going to get it right or I'm just going to go with it wrong. Saul had traveled. Think about where you were 5 years ago. Where are you today? Saul had traveled a long ways. Notice what Peter says. For this very reason, make every effort to supplement your faith with virtue, and virtue with knowledge, and knowledge with self-control, and self-control with steadfastness, and steadfastness with goodness, and godliness with brotherly affection, and brotherly affection with love. For if these qualities are yours and are increasing, they keep you from being ineffective or unfruitful in the knowledge of our Lord Jesus Christ. Saul had went the exact opposite direction. Are we adding to our faith? Are we building? Fifthly and lastly, Saul went from banishing error to befriending it. From banishing error to befriending it. 1 Samuel, the 28th chapter, my kind of recapitulation of Saul's story, I did mention this. But Saul is at the very end here. And he wants to talk to Samuel, but there's a problem. He can't talk to Samuel because Samuel's dead. And so he says, I want a medium. I'm going to seek out a medium so I can talk to Samuel. You know what the difficulty is with Saul finding a medium at this point? Earlier, he had banished them all. And they refused to leave, he had killed. In fact, when he finds the witch of Endor, she thinks it's a trap. Surely Saul's not seeking, this is a trap. But it's not. It's not. The very evil that God had condemned, that Saul had banished from the kingdom, he's now befriending and trying to bring back Samuel. Now, I want to end with this last and final thought. Quickly, we can run back down through here, obviously. We want to strive to enhance our humility. Although if we're truly humble, we might not recognize that. We want to be fearless in the ways of the Lord. People that are marked by joy, under control, and willing to take stands against falsehood. But why did Saul go to the witch of Endor? I'm going to suggest to you it's because Saul had no other friends. Saul had nowhere else to turn. The reason for that is because of the direction of his life. It's a very different picture than what we've been seeing in David. It's a very different picture than what we're seeing in the Christian people. I encourage you, make sure that you're adding to your faith, that you're traveling in the direction of becoming closer to God and in the effectiveness of his gospel. This evening, if we can encourage you in any way to get closer to God, to know more about him, just simply to pray with you, or if you have any spiritual need that we can assist, I encourage you to make it known as together we stand and sing.